August 1945. The guns finally fell silent. The smoke drifted away from the ruins of Berlin and the scorched islands of the Pacific. The Second World War, the greatest cataclysm in human history, was over. But as the cheering crowds filled Times Square and soldiers began the long journey home, the United States government woke up to a new, silent crisis. They had built a war machine of unprecedented scale, a juggernaut of logistics that had crushed the Axis powers through sheer industrial weight. Now, that machine had stopped, but the momentum remained. The symbol of this industrial might was not the atomic bomb, nor the B-29 superfortress. It was a small, four-wheeled, olive-drab box, the Jeep. To understand the magnitude of the problem, you have to look at the numbers. During the war, the United States didn't just build vehicles. It flooded the world with them. Willys Overland and Ford, operating under government contracts that ran 24 hours a day, had produced over 640,000 Jeeps. That is one Jeep for every 100 soldiers, sailors, and airmen. They were rolling off the assembly lines at a rate of 1 every 2 minutes. They were the mechanical cockroaches of the war, indestructible, omnipresent, and essential. General George Marshall called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. But in the autumn of 1945, the contribution became a liability. Imagine the scene at the ordnance depots in the Philippines, in Okinawa, in France, and in Italy. We aren't talking about parking lots. We are talking about horizons. Aerial reconnaissance photos from late 1945 show fields that look like green carpets. Zoom in and you realize the carpet is made of thousands upon thousands of Jeeps, bumper to bumper, stretching as far as the eye can see. This was the steel tsunami. The logistics of peace turned out to be far more complex than the logistics of war. In war, the objective is simple. Get the equipment to the front, no matter the cost. In peace, the question becomes, does the cost justify the return? The United States faced a brutal economic calculation. These vehicles were thousands of miles away. To bring a single Jeep back from the Pacific Theater to San Francisco required shipping, tonnage, fuel, manpower, and time. The cost of shipping a used, war-weary Jeep back to the US often exceeded the value of the vehicle itself. Furthermore, there was a fear back home. A fear that haunted the politicians and the captains of industry in Detroit. The memory of the Great Depression was still fresh. The US economy was terrified of a crash. Automakers like Ford, General Motors, and Willys were pivoting back to civilian production. They wanted to sell new cars to returning veterans. They did not want the market flooded with 500,000 cheap, surplus military vehicles. If every farmer and mechanic in America could buy a war surplus Jeep for $50, who would buy the new 1,946 models rolling out of Detroit? So, the decision was made. A decision that was cold, calculated, and purely economic. Most of them would not come home. The steel tsunami was frozen in place. In the Pacific, on islands that had been violently contested just months prior, the Jeeps sat baking in the tropical sun. In Europe, they sat in the mud of staging areas, waiting for orders that would never come. They were brand new, some with less than 5 miles on the odometer. Others were battle-hardened veterans with bullet holes in the fenders. It didn't matter. To the War Department, they were just numbers on a ledger that no longer balanced. The surplus was so massive that it defied comprehension. There were stories of supply ships already at sea when the surrender was signed, turning around and dumping their cargo brand new Jeeps, still in their crates, into the ocean because it was cheaper than unloading them. While these stories are often debated, the reality on land was undeniable. The United States had built a mountain of steel to save the world, and now they had to figure out how to bury it. This chapter of history is the story of excess. It is the story of an industrial capacity so overwhelming that when the war ended it left behind a mechanical residue that covered the globe. The Jeep had won the war, but in 1945, it became the world's largest orphan. The soldiers were going home. The Jeeps were staying behind. And what happened next would become the stuff of legend, tragedy, and urban myth. The steel tsunami had crashed onto the shores of peace, and the water was about to recede, leaving the wreckage exposed for all to see. The most painful sound of the post-war era wasn't the silence of the dead. For many veterans, it was the screech of metal tearing against coral. By 1946, the logic of logistics had turned cruel. The United States possessed a surplus of military hardware that was embarrassing in its magnitude. In the Pacific Theater alone, thousands of islands were stockpiled with enough jeeps, trucks, and bulldozers to build a small nation. But the order from Washington was clear: bring the men home, leave the machines. But you couldn't just leave a fully fueled war machine sitting on a beach. It was a political liability and a potential weapon for local insurgencies. The solution was the Great Disposal. And nowhere was this act of industrial suicide more visible or more heartbreaking than at a place now known as Million Dollar Point. On the island of Espiritu Santo in Vanuatu, the US military had established a massive supply base. When the war ended, the Americans offered to sell the equipment to the French and British colonial governments for pennies on the dollar. It was a steal, but the colonial powers hesitated. They looked at the stockpiles and made a calculated gamble. They assumed that the Americans, desperate to leave, would simply abandon the gear, allowing them to take it for free. They gambled wrong. The American commanders, insulted by the refusal and under strict orders not to crash the market, decided to make a statement. If they couldn't sell it and they couldn't ship it, they would ensure no one else could use it. Eyewitness accounts from that day describe a scene of organized madness. The Seabees, the construction battalions, built a massive stone ramp extending into the ocean. Then, the procession began. It wasn't just old, broken equipment. It was brand new Willys Jeeps, still in their crate grease. It was massive bulldozers, heavy 6x6 trucks, and crates of Coca-Cola. Drivers would line the vehicles up, put them in gear, tie a brick to the accelerator, and jump out at the last second. One by one, the heroes of the war drove themselves into the sea. Veterans who watched the event recall crying. These weren't just cars to them. The Jeep had been their lifeline. It had carried their wounded, brought their mail, and saved their lives. To see them drowning in the saltwater felt like a betrayal. The water around the point churned with oil and fuel. As the pile of metal grew, the bulldozers were used to crush the vehicles down, flattening them to make room for more. By the time it was over, millions of dollars worth of equipment lay rusting in the shallow water. In Europe, the disposal took a different, equally violent form. The Atlantic was too rough for shallow dumping, and the scrap metal was needed for the reconstruction of a shattered continent. Here, the crushers went to work. In depots across France and Germany, Jeeps were lined up in rows of hundreds. They didn't use hydraulic presses. They used what they had: tanks. Sherman tanks would drive up and down the rows of parked Jeeps, their tracks flattening the smaller vehicles into pancakes of twisted steel. It was a brutal efficiency. A tank could destroy a Jeep in seconds. Once flattened, the carcasses were stacked like firewood and sold for scrap weight. There are stories, often repeated, of crates being pushed off aircraft carriers in the middle of the ocean. While the Jeep in a crate for $50 remains a myth, the deep-sea dumping was real. Manifests show ships loaded with rolling stock, leaving port and arriving empty, having lightened their load in the Mariana Trench. The Great Disposal was the dark hangover of the victory party. It was the ultimate demonstration of American industrial power, not that they could build so much, but that they could afford to throw it all away. Today, if you dive off the coast of Vanuatu, you can still see them. The coral has encrusted the steering wheels, and fish swim through the rusted chassis of the Willys Jeeps. They remain there, a ghostly underwater parking lot, a silent monument to the moment when the world had too much steel and nowhere to put it. The war was over, and the machines that won it were given a Viking funeral, not with fire, but with salt water. When the tide of American troops receded from the globe in 1945, they left behind more than just goodwill and political influence. They left behind a mechanical diaspora. In the jungles of Asia, the deserts of Africa, and the ruined cities of Europe, thousands of Jeeps remained. They were battered, broken, or simply abandoned because they were too expensive to ship home. But in these left-behind legions, the locals didn't see garbage. They saw opportunity. They saw a blueprint. The most vibrant and chaotic evolution occurred in the Philippines. As the US Army departed Manila, they sold or abandoned hundreds of surplus Jeeps to a population desperate for public transportation. The war had destroyed the city's infrastructure, and there were no buses or trains. The Filipinos looked at the small, 4-seat Willys MB and decided it wasn't big enough. In backyard workshops, mechanics began to hack the vehicles apart. They cut the chassis in half and welded in extensions, stretching the body to accommodate 2 long benches in the back. They stripped the olive drab paint and replaced it with a riot of color. They added chrome ornaments, religious icons, and flashing lights. The jeepney was born. It was a symbol of Filipino resilience, taking the machine of a foreign occupier and transforming it into a uniquely national cultural icon. The jeepney became the backbone of the country's transport system, a rolling piece of folk art that proved the Jeep's design was endlessly adaptable. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, on a rainy farm in Anglesey, Wales, the Jeep was about to become a father. Maurice Wilkes, the chief designer for the Rover Car Company, was using a surplus Willys Jeep to do work on his farm. He loved its utility, but the war surplus vehicle was tired, and parts were hard to find. When his brother asked him what he would do when the Jeep finally died, Wilkes famously replied, "I shall have to build one myself." That conversation sparked the creation of the Land Rover. In 1947, the first prototype, the center steer, was built on a literal Jeep chassis. The early Land Rovers shared the Jeep's 80-inch wheelbase and its utilitarian philosophy. The British took the American concept, slowed it down, made it boxier, and built it out of aluminum because steel was rationed. But make no mistake, without the abandoned Willys Jeep sitting in Maurice Wilkes' barn, the Land Rover, the icon of British exploration, would never have existed. The ripple effect continued to Japan. In the late 1942, the country was under US occupation and struggling to rebuild. The roads were terrible, and the US military needed reliable vehicles that could be manufactured locally. Toyota, a company that had spent the war building trucks for the Imperial Army, was given a task. They were asked to build a light utility vehicle similar to the American Jeep. Toyota's engineers took the concept and reverse engineered it. In 1951, they drove their prototype, the Toyota BJ, up the side of Mount Fuji, higher than any vehicle had ever gone before. It was powerful, rugged, and clearly inspired by the American machines patrolling the streets of Tokyo. The BJ would eventually be renamed the Land Cruiser. Today, the Land Cruiser is the gold standard of reliability in the developing world, but its DNA is undeniably American. When the tide of American troops receded from the globe in 1945, they left behind more than just goodwill and political influence. They left behind a mechanical diaspora. In the jungles of Asia, the deserts of Africa, and the ruined cities of Europe, thousands of Jeeps remained. They were battered, broken, or simply abandoned because they were too expensive to ship home. But in these left-behind legions, the locals didn't see garbage. They saw opportunity. They saw a blueprint. The most vibrant and chaotic evolution occurred in the Philippines. As the US Army departed Manila, they sold or abandoned hundreds of surplus Jeeps to a population desperate for public transportation. The war had destroyed the city's infrastructure, and there were no buses or trains. The Filipinos looked at the small, 4-seat Willys MB and decided it wasn't big enough. In backyard workshops, mechanics began to hack the vehicles apart. When the tide of American troops finally receded from the globe in 1945, they left behind more than just political influence and cigarettes. they left behind a mechanical diaspora. In the steamy jungles of the Philippines, the rainy farmlands of Great Britain, and the shattered industrial zones of Japan, thousands of Willys MBs and Ford GPWs remained. They were battered, broken, or simply abandoned because the economics of shipping them home didn't make sense. But in these left-behind legions, the locals didn't see garbage. They saw a blueprint. They saw the future. The most vibrant, chaotic, and colorful evolution occurred in the Philippines. As the US Army departed the ruins of Manila, they left a city with no infrastructure. The tram network was destroyed. There were no buses. But there were surplus Jeeps, acres of them. Enterprising Filipino mechanics looked at the small, four-seat American Scout car and decided it wasn't big enough. In backyard workshops, using acetylene torches and scrap metal, they began to hack the vehicles apart. They cut the chassis in half and welded in extensions, stretching the body to accommodate two long benches in the back where passengers could sit knee to knee. They stripped the drab military green paint and replaced it with a riot of color. They added chrome ornaments, religious icons, and flashing lights. The jeepney was born. It was a symbol of Filipino resilience, taking the machine of a foreign occupier and transforming it into a uniquely national cultural icon. The jeepney became the backbone of the country's transport system, a rolling piece of folk art that proved the Jeep's design was endlessly adaptable. It was the first sign that the Jeep was no longer just an American soldier. It was becoming a citizen of the world. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, on a rainy farm in Anglesey, Wales, the Jeep was about to become a father. Maurice Wilkes, the chief designer for the Rover Car Company, was using a surplus Willys Jeep to do work on his land. He dragged timber, plowed fields, and navigated the mud. He loved its utility, but the war surplus vehicle was tired. It was falling apart. One day in 1947, his brother Spencer asked him a simple question. What will you do when the Jeep finally dies? Maurice thought for a moment and replied, I suppose I shall have to build one myself. That conversation, which legend says continued with a sketch drawn in the sand at Red Wharf Bay, sparked the creation of the Land Rover. The connection was literal. The very first prototype of the Land Rover, the famous center steer, was built directly onto the chassis of a jagged, war-weary Willys Jeep. The British engineers took the American concept, slowed it down, made it boxier, and built the body out of aluminum because steel was still rationed in post-war Britain. When the Land Rover series was unveiled in Amsterdam in 1948, the world saw a British icon. But underneath the aluminum skin, the ghost of the American Jeep was holding the frame together. The vehicle that would eventually conquer the African savanna and the Australian outback was, at its heart, a child of the Willys MB. The ripple effect continued to the defeated nation of Japan. In 1950, the Korean War broke out nearby, and the US military needed vehicles fast. They turned to the Japanese industry they were helping to rebuild. Toyota, a company that had been devastated by the war, was given a challenge. They were asked to build a light utility vehicle similar to the American Jeep. Toyota's engineers didn't just copy, they aimed to improve. They took the concept of a compact 4x4 and combined it with a larger, more powerful engine from their truck line. The result was the Toyota BJ. In July 1951, to prove the machine's worth, test driver Ichiro Taira did something impossible. He drove the prototype up the side of Mount Fuji. He didn't stop at the roads. He climbed the vertical trails to the 6th station, higher than any motorized vehicle had ever gone before. The feat was so impressive that the National Police Agency immediately placed an order. The Toyota BJ would eventually be renamed the Land Cruiser. Today, the Land Cruiser is considered the gold standard of reliability in the harshest environments on Earth. But its DNA is undeniably American. In fact, early models were even called the Toyota Jeep until Willys lawyers sent a cease and desist letter. This is the hidden legacy of the left-behind legions. The surplus Jeeps didn't just rust away in foreign fields. They acted as seeds. They were the mechanical atom from which the entire family tree of modern off-road vehicles descended. Every time you see a Land Rover Defender crossing the Serengeti, a Toyota Land Cruiser navigating the United Nations convoys, or a vibrant jeepney honking in Manila traffic. You are looking at the great-grandchildren of the Willys MB. For 7 decades, a ghost story has haunted the garages and barbershops of America. It is not a story of monsters, but of metal. It is the story of the Jeep in a crate. If you grew up in the United States between 1950 and 1980, you probably saw the advertisement. It was small, usually tucked in the back pages of magazines like Popular Mechanics or Boy's Life. The text was simple and seductive. Surplus Jeeps, $50. The image burned itself into the collective imagination of a nation. It promised a brand new, grease-covered Willys MB, disassembled and packed tightly into a wooden crate, waiting for you to pry it open and assemble it like a giant model kit. For $50, any teenager could own a piece of the war. It was the ultimate bargain. It was the ultimate dream. But like most dreams, it was largely a lie. The myth of the $50 crate is perhaps the greatest piece of accidental marketing in history. Here is the cold reality. The United States government did not sell single Jeeps to civilians. They sold them in lots, hundreds or thousands at a time, to authorized dealers. And they certainly didn't sell them for $50. The scrap value of the steel alone was often worth more than that. So, what were those advertisements selling? They were selling a pamphlet. If you sent your $50, you didn't get a crate delivered to your driveway. You got a booklet explaining how to bid on government surplus auctions. It was a bait and switch of epic proportions. Furthermore, the Jeep in a crate itself was a rarity. While Ford and Willys did crate Jeeps for overseas shipping, putting the wheels and windshield in the back to save space, most were assembled upon arrival. By the time the surplus sales began, the Jeeps were used, abused, and sitting in open fields. If you bought a surplus Jeep in 1947, you weren't getting a pristine kit. You were getting a vehicle with a cracked engine block, missing seats, and bullet holes, likely for around $300, which, adjusted for inflation, is thousands of dollars today. But the myth persisted because people wanted it to be true. And as the decades passed, a strange alchemy took place. The rust began to turn into gold. In the immediate post-war years, the Jeep was just a tool. It was cheap farm equipment. Farmers welded steel roofs onto them. They cut holes in the floor to run machinery. They drove them into the ground until they died, then parked them in the barn and forgot about them. But by the 1,980 seconds and 90 seconds, the generation that fought the war began to look back with nostalgia. The Jeep wasn't just a tractor anymore. It was a symbol of their youth, their courage, and the moment they saved the world. The restoration movement began. Suddenly, those rotting carcasses in the barns became barn finds. The market shifted violently. A vehicle that was sold for scrap weight in 1946 is now one of the most sought-after collector vehicles in the world. Today, a genuine, numbers-matching Willys MB or Ford GPW, restored to factory condition, does not sell for $50. It can command prices upwards of $30, $40, or even $50,000 at high-end auctions. Collectors now hunt for the holy grail, the elusive, unopened crate. In rare, almost miraculous instances, they have actually been found. A crate left in a warehouse in the Philippines, a forgotten stockpile in a Norwegian bunker. When these crates are opened today, it is an archaeological event. Mechanics carefully wipe away the 80-year-old cosmoline grease, revealing factory-fresh paint that hasn't seen the sun since 1944. The air in the room smells of old oil and history. The irony is complete. The cheap, disposable tool of war has become a precious artifact. The steel tsunami that was once bulldozed into the ocean is now carefully preserved in climate-controlled garages. As we look back at the legacy of the Jeep, we realize that its value was never really about the metal. The Jeep is the most recognizable automotive silhouette in history. It is the DNA of every 4x4 on the road today. But more than that, it is a vessel for memory. Whether it's a rusted Hulk in a field or a pristine showpiece on a podium, the Jeep tells the story of how America built a machine to conquer the world, tried to throw it away, and then spent the next century falling in love with it all over again. The $50 crate may have been a myth, but the value of the legend is priceless.